You've tuned into the Bellingham Podcast for the week of March 22nd, 2021. This is episode 184. From that, Spring is Springing, City by the Sailor Sea, I'm AJ Barcay.
And straight out of 98226, I am Chris Powell. On this episode, AJ and I are talking about cancel culture. No, not cancel culture. That's been talked to death. We got a different kind of culture we're going to talk about. The collection culture. The past, present, and future of acquiring things, both analog and digital. Won't you join us in this conversation? Add this to your podcast feed. Collect them all. This, dear friends and neighbors, is the Bellingham Podcast.
Gotta catch them all. Gotta catch them all. Chris, how you doing?
I'm doing just fine, AJ. It's wonderful to be indoors at a distance still, recording with a beautiful little bit of sunshine out there. It's nice to see the Earth tilting on its axis in the northern hemisphere towards the sun gradually. How are you doing?
I'm soaking in the vitamin D as much as I can. And looking forward to this episode, dude. This is going to be a two-parter.
Yes, because there's a lot to discuss as far as the world of collecting and all that is involved, a little bit of past, present, and future about what's going on. The impetus for this episode was talking about a three-lettered anagram that I'm still thinking of, like no funds transferred
NFTs,
or not. I want to keep the show clean still.
Yes, please.
NFT.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that more later on, but this is a new kind of thing that people have been seeing headlines about digital stuff that you can pay money for.
Oh, yes.
But let's go back. Let's take the podcast DeLorean back a ways and talk about the history of collecting as a hobby.
Yeah, so hopping into the podcast TARDIS, to set this up, we have to understand where collecting and collection comes from. And realistically speaking, of course, our normal disclosures at the top of the show, Chris Powell and I are not historians, nor do we play one on podcasts.
But if we were, we'd be able to go back in time and recall all those wonderful events better than most of y'all out there.
So coming back from the void here, what we're going to prime this with is the concept of human history and how we kind of got this notion of collecting, because relatively speaking, outside of a naturalistic instinct to collect food or to collect water and sustenance, outside of the primitive things, we, in civilized culture, really the first collection was knowledge back in the day. We can point all the way back to maybe the Library of Alexandria as the culmination and collecting of human knowledge, the most valuable thing, the most limited editions, as it were, or special editions of the time.
It's collector's time, collector's editions, yes.
Where you had a book one of one that was only one printing,
Right.
And this was, that was the essence of collecting, where we had people of scholarship. And yes, there was the influences of the day. Kings and monarchs were collecting gold for, the sake of monetary investment. We'll get into that later in a more contemporary thing. But really, if we look at it outside of the royals and elites, you've got the Egyptians collecting books over time, and then we get it built into the Library of Alexandria. If for my Assassin's Creed lovers out there, the Medici family, us Italians of descent, may remember during the Renaissance Florence, where of course they were collecting private patronage. And this is by way that we got artists being free for the first time to be able to do what they wanted to create. Now, granted, that was also for the kings and churches of the time, but this notion of citizenship through art, private art collecting, we still see today, right? So we have people who are connoisseurs of private arts, more contemporarily, like you might have heard of the artist Banksy, who's kind of anti of this culture. Mm-hmm. A street artist.
He's a disruptor.
He is a disruptor. I mean, he did dare I say, a stagecraft performance for a auction recently, where there was a work of art of Banksy, and upon it being sold for millions, there was in the frame a grinder that took the work, ground it down to nothing. Basically, it would destroy the work, which kind of shows this culture of what are you collecting, and that's really the primer for this.
Yep.
kind of fast forwarding from like, I don't know, the third millennium BCE of like, Alexandria forward, we get the first public museum, and museums are a fork, as it were. No, we're not ending the show yet, Chris. Calm
But that's
down.
a good one. I'll refer to that one in a little while.
Museums, right? So you have these people, whether that be monarchs or individuals, who create and collect and curate these things. Well, what good is it if you can't share this knowledge? Because again, that's where the essence of collecting came from, is this knowledge and growth. So forgive me to our mates across the pond if I'm going to slaughter this. In Oxford, there's the Ashmolean Public Museum, which is attributed as the first public museum in the world. So from this, we get community, because a collection is only really as good as a community that can be shared with, right? So you have all of this collected works. For one individual to have this and it never see the light of day, what good is that? That individual gains growth from it, gains pleasure from it. But really, if you have this wealth of knowledge, like the Library of Alexandria, for it to just go up in flames, sorry, historians, I know that might be a touchy trigger word for you, but for it to go up in flames is kind of a travesty.
Yeah, it harkens back to a lesson I learned way back, where you have a certain kind of talent. And if you keep that talent to yourself, it doesn't really do much for the world. But if you share that talent, it can grow in ways you're not aware of. And it's also a shared experience for others to gather in a community locale, pre-COVID, of course.
Of course.
And to take a look at a work of art or a reading or of something, a sculpture, an item, and to discuss it, and to debate it, and to learn more about it, and to enhance its value in you. For that's where the museums really took flight in some cases.
You also get derivative works. You also get the body of work, whatever that collection curation is. Obviously, there's this argument, there is no new originality. It's always a derivative work. Well, how can you get that primer, that original, the Mona Lisa, right? Like, if you have not gone to study that work or whatever, whether that be a Michelangelo or the martial arts, whatever, you have to go to the original works or the body of works to be able to understand and carry forward whatever that art, I'm using that word loosely here, folks, that art is.
Well, martial art or ink art or other types of art, as far as like clay art or whatever have you. There's many different kinds of arts.
Instead of saying a widget, I'm just saying a work of art, because, I mean, whatever you're collecting, whether that be a comic book or a toy or, I don't know, a musket from the Revolutionary War here in the United States, I'm using the term art loosely for all of those works of art in a collection. So we get the etymology, okay? Collecting. What is collecting? Well, okay, Google, what is collecting?
Don't do that, man. All these phones just went off right now.
Hey, Alexa. Okay.
The hobby of collecting includes seeking and locating and acquiring and organizing, cataloging, displaying. Can you tell that I'm making this up on my own? No, we're citing it from a reference. Storing and maintaining items that are of interest to an individual person known as a collector. These differ in a wide variety of manners, obviously based on what one is containing. But as far as its purpose, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, as far as the purpose of collecting as a hobby or as a passion or as a mission, and its presentation, in which we'll talk about in some ways. So buckle up for some self-checks right there. There's so many different types of collections. I'm paraphrasing now, going off script from what our show notes have. But there's just a vast number of opportunities. It doesn't have to be what AJ and I are going to talk about, because we're just two knuckleheads that had our own experience in collections that we'll talk about in a little bit. Some are a lot more popular than others, as evidenced by some of the headlines you might be seeing about that 3-lettered acronym or some other types of terms that really weren't present in, let's just say 2008.
Right.
So, it's the etymology, the definition of collecting. It's acquiring things, knowledge things, material, experiences, memories. Let's go for it.
Yep. So I'm going to take that, and I'm going to do a little bit of a tangent. So you use the word hobby, and this was something that was interesting when I was looking into the word collecting, that definition. So collecting and hobby, they go hand in hand. And I'm going to throw this out just because I thought it's kind of funny. We all have to kind of get off of our collecting high horse. Collecting and hobby, the word hobby in the 16th century, Hobyen, Hobyn, had a meaning of a small horse or pony. And the term hobby horse was first documented in around like 1556. A payment confirmation for a hobby horse from Reading, England, mates across the pond. The item, originally called a tourney horse, was made of a wooden basket work frame, an artificial tail and head. So like those little, a kid's toy type thing, right? It was originally designed for children to mimic real riding. And then in like 1816...
Fast forward to about 2 centuries.
Right. We get this derivative hobby was introduced. And I'm paraphrasing here because I'm guessing nostalgia of that hobby horse, right? So a hobby horse, you're a kid, you're having fun. And so Hobbyen, hobby horse, hobby is that derivative of like leisure and collecting and of better times, which we will also talk about later. So again, what's interesting is that collecting and hobby, so the hobby is collecting. Collecting is a hobby.
You got. I lost you on that one. Collecting there is no spoon. Hobby.
There is no spoon. Thanks, Theo.
Hobby is not collecting, but collecting can be a hobby.
Yes.
Hobby is an act.
Yes.
Collecting could be an act too. I'm trying to like get this settled in my mind.
No, I was too. And that's what's interesting is these two words go hand in hand, and they come from different, just from a word standpoint and from a cultural standpoint, they come from different roots as well, which is the reason why I just was throwing it in. Again, we are not literary professionals.
If we were, we'd be taking up more time slots on KMRE 102.3 FM.
You can collect us on Saturday mornings and on kmre.org.
That's right, exactly. They're kind enough to play our episodes on 3 p.m. in the afternoon on the weekends. We collect presets on our FM dial and our radio devices and things like that. Anyway, thanks KMRE for hosting our show.
Thank you, KMRE, for collecting our show.
That's right.
So, okay, so now that we've kind of got a good of pre-funk, we've got the history, we've got the etymology of collecting and hobbying. Let's talk about kind of the more contemporary. And this is in collector culture. There's this thing, this dare I say, token phrase that gets thrown about called the collector's gene, where a lot of people just gravitate towards collecting by quote nature, and whether that be like as a kid, right? You collected bottle caps back in the day or whatever, and so. You and I chatted off the mic, and I kind of derived these kind of subsects of what creates that collector's gene, and I'm going to really harp on more of these a little bit later because we kind of see it being fostered for good and for bad when we look at social media. Yeah. It plays, again, we have algorithms and companies that play on this characteristic or trait that some of us may have or had fostered since a young age, and we just are blind to it.
We had initially talked about one of the darker sides of collecting, as I've referred to it as GAS, Gear Acquisition Syndrome. Yeah. Collector's gene. Some are naughty by nature and some are collectors by nature. And this is a way that, it has it for good and for bad. Let's talk about some of the good ways one might want to do some collecting, acquiring, and other things.
So when we first look at it, let's look at functionality first. Mm-hmm. Okay. So you may collect based off of the sheer functionality of something. Gear. Let's take that one as an example, right? So if you're a musician, obviously there is certain gear that you will want to have to do said gig, right? Or if you are a homeowner, there's some tools you're going to have to keep your house up, from not flooding.
In which some people might say, who aren't the collectors of these type of tools, why do you need 3 different types of flat blade screwdrivers? Well, all of the fixers out there would say, well, person.
Chris.
Yeah. It's because one is a small that I can do for these jobs and one is another one for these jobs. The same principle for tools and gear could also be described For those who may be aficionados of the shoes, sneaker culture,
Yeah.
it's not just for the high heels or the pumps or anything. If you find a pair of shoes that work, you can get a whole lot of different colors to match your outfits,
Yep.
as opposed to one pair of shoes to rule them all. Those tools and that gear allow you to have better functionality with your life or your pursuits, professionally or personally.
And this will kind of help with those that like were struggling with my hobby versus collecting analogy. So for instance, in the Pacific Northwest, there is a functionality to the gear of backpacking.
Yes.
Because your hobby may be that you go out and you like to do a fair bit of trekking, like Captain Get Out here. Now, the hobby is you go out and you go do a fair bit of trekking. And then there's the collecting. You collect the life straw, the backpack, the lightweight tent, and that's where the dark side comes in. If you are so into the acquiring of the gear to the point where you have so much gear, more time spent in the gear than in the outdoors, that's where the dark side of collecting comes in, which kind of goes into the second part of this whole FOMO culture. I mean, Chris and I have talked about this ad nauseum.
Fear of missing out for the kids, how the kids describe it.
Right. You've got this, if you feel like you're doing a hobby and you're collecting in that hobby, and all of a sudden you feel this twang where you make a purchase and then you're really struggling about it, but you're like, whatever, I gotta have it. And then you do that on a Friday, and then come Monday morning, you have this almost hangover of like, oh my gosh, what have I done? That is perhaps something playing on your fear of missing out. And hopefully you can undo that purchase. On the flip side of this, we also see this hoarding fear, which I'm coining it FOBW. I don't know. FOBW. FOBW, fear of being without. And we see this also. I'm not trying to point out anybody in our listener sphere, but like I see this typically a lot in older generations where they bought something and they held on to it because they did use it back in the day, but they held on to it for decades later.
We might need it someday
because I might need it again.
Yeah.
As opposed to either selling it or donating it, giving it to somebody else, and then reacquiring it later in life. And then also allowing themselves to upgrade,
Yep.
Because, that, let's say a saw is a saw. Well, you may have a saw from 1918.
Yes.
That was great for your great great grandfather, but, try to find parts or, repair that engine if it even has an electric engine. Maybe it's steam powered.
I would say that 1918 saw is a nice segue from going from functionality for a tool to nostalgia.
Right.
In which you are acquiring something, collecting something based on its historical value or the emotional connection you might have with that. This is my grandpappy's saw.
Right.
He used this to build the first home that my family had back in 1906. That is something that one would keep. And to try to acquire like kinds, maybe on the Bay or other online type things, or even rummage sales or flea markets, to try to have multiple versions of that because it invokes that wonderful feeling of emotional connection that we got to the past.
Right. Even though Grandpappy's hobby was woodworking.
Sure.
So again, that's where this notion, TikTok, as it were,
yes.
of collecting and hobby, they go together, but are in different ways. Like the hobby isn't really the addiction, the collecting is.
Yeah, I can see that.
So nostalgia of this is a subsect of nostalgia can also be memorabilia, right? So for instance, and this is interesting because I've never been a sports nut. It's just not in my ethos. For those that are sports aficionados, memorabilia is another word that gets thrown in the collecting and hobby sphere. It tends to kick in right around nostalgia and also scholarship, which we'll get to in a second. And nostalgia is defined as, quote, object kept or collected because of their historical interest, especially those associated with memorable people or events.
This is a good instance for being someone who was a sports fan for many years before the chest thumping brigade tend to take over a lot of professional sports. To have an autographed jersey of your favorite football star, to have an autographed baseball, back in the day, one of my prized possessions was an autographed baseball by Reggie Jackson. Now, Reggie Jackson, for those of you who are unaware, he was a baseball player in the 70s and 80s with the New York Yankees. Very popular, very talented. His nickname was Mr. October because those darn Yankees made it to the World Series on numerous occasions, and also previously the Oakland Athletics in the early 70s. Golly, I'm old. But fun fact, Reggie Jackson, in the off-season of baseball, worked with my father at a automobile dealership in the Bay Area where I was a youngster. And there's one time during the summer where I went with my dad to work, and Reggie was there. And my dad was able to introduce me to Reggie Jackson, who was selling cars. He was a big car nut, similar to Jay Leno for the modern fans. But he worked at this dealership, and I peeked in one time. My dad warned me, don't get in trouble, but he was filming a commercial for broadcast TV for that. But I got to meet him. I got the autographed baseball, and that stood proudly on my room's shelf,
right?
For all to, because that made me feel good. I had a connection because I met the guy.
Yeah.
And that is nostalgia, memorabilia, and perhaps if we wanted to, talking about the investment of a collecting item.
Right. So investment creeps into hobby and collecting a lot. And this is where I kind of fork the concept of collecting.
Here it is again. Not yet, folks. We're still going.
We still got like 10 more minutes. So with collecting, you have people who collect for themselves. Like that story, by the way, Chris Powell did not tell me that story. That's not in our show notes. Awesome story.
Thank you very much.
So again, you got that because of a personal story and the just timing. And do you still have that ball?
No. Unfortunately, that got lost in the shuffle of life occurrences when I'm transitioning from living at home to college to my own place. It went somewhere else. But
the importance is like you don't. I'm glad that you don't, because it feeds in well. You have the memory, like the ball itself. Like a lot of people get so hung up on the fact that when they collect something, the physical item is the memory, as opposed to the memory leading up to the item. And in investment, that kind of goes, investment contradicts that to its core, because you're acquiring something that you may not have a tangible connection to. You're doing it just for speculation.
Yeah. And that speculation can also have that dark side.
Exactly.
I bought this for you, Luke.
No!
You can sell it on eBay to someone for a lot of money.
You are not my hobby!
That was pretty good. No, some family or friends you would have something that they aren't familiar with the resale world, as AJ and I have talked about on numerous episodes of the Bellingham podcast. And so like, hey, we found this at a garage sale, or we acquired this. Could you use this and maybe sell it? But if the thing is, you would make a certain amount of money profit, maybe, on the sale of that, which gets eaten up in shipping and those eBay fees to list the item. So there's a lot more to it. But, Warren Buffett often was very shrewd in the companies he would invest in. Yeah. I don't want to put him in past tense. He's still there as an awesome stock investor, but he would have a huge amount of shrewdness in picking off someone, as opposed to a wide variety of criteria, as opposed to, they're the current doll of the stock market right now. Sure. Hi, GameStop. And he would be very cautious in making these prudent investments that often had great return on investment for that. Anyway. Yeah.
Which, again, Chris Powell and AJ Barce are not fiduciaries, nor do we play one on podcasts.
I wish I would, because I'd have a heck of a lot more money to be able to collect. I like collecting the Benjamins, No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, we're not financial dudes, but Warren Buffett is, and he's a stud at it.
If you say so.
Well, yeah, if Warren Buffett...
He old? He's an old dude.
He's one of our elder statesmen in this society. Yes, Mr. Buffett, if you're listening to this, and you have an open invitation to join us on the Bellingham podcast.
If Warren Buffett listens to our show, you can come up on our show.
And I'd be collecting shocked faces if that would be the case. All right, let's move on.
So the last two on this breakdown of the collector's gene, we tagged on it of scholarship. I'm also going to flip on this because we talked off the mic of also skill. So scholarship within the items of collecting things, but collecting skills, whether that be for self-improvement, on your own time or own dime, if you're doing like online courses for certificates, like Credly or whatever or whatnot. I would even go so far as just personal development is collecting skills. This is how like Art of Manliness got really created.
Yep.
Is, to foster a community of people of like mind who wanted to develop themselves in skills that maybe have been falling by the wayside in society.
AJ, you are so, polishing this thing. It's for lunkhead guys to try to improve themselves. Look, I used to be a lunkhead guy, and I did a whole lot of collecting of recipes because eventually I realized in my dumb Neanderthal mind, I might have to cook dinner for a lovely lady someday. This is pre-wife. And so I would collect the knowledge on how to not burn
a chicken
water when I boiled it. Come on. And so these skills, how do I set a table with the appropriate utensils? How do not with forks and knives and spoons? Yeah. But anyway, you get these skills that are not just for your professional micro credentials to make yourself worthy of a higher paycheck. You also may need to be able to learn, I never learned how to change a diaper. I get to acquire this skill really quick. I collected all these skills as a dad. Now, for a lot of dads out there, yes, I never had that opportunity because I was a blended family, and
sure,
daughter was 7 when I jumped in. That's a different story. Already explained in a different podcasts. But those skills are the investment in yourself, and we are worth it to take that time.
Yeah.
Whether speculative collecting versus skill collecting.
Yeah.
I don't know why
investing.
Yeah.
So like again, dovetailing back to the last point, which is investment. Scholarship and skill and investment kind of go hand in hand, depending on how you define it. Is how we're going for
to
it.
meet someone who has a extensive skill set of abilities is much more impressive to me than someone who has a wall full of pictures of them with celebrities.
Sure.
That's just saying. Moving on.
The last one is time and place, because there are people who collect. And again, there's a dark side to this as well. But this was something that I remember even from my youth, where I have a great auntie who used to travel by RVing, caravanning, right, across the United States. And I remember distinctly as a kid when she would come visit, on the side of the RV was a vinyl map of the United States. Oh. And each of the states had a different color for when auntie and uncle would go to those states. And I remember that. And at an early age, I thought that was the coolest thing because I wanted to be well-traveled and stuff. And I traveled quite a bit as a kid on the left side of the United States. But it was just interesting because from her, I remember, like, it wasn't as much getting the sticker on the RV. It was more about, I went to this great diner that nobody ever talked about. And that's where I kind of got that part of my personality, was from my great auntie. Mm-hmm. And her, when she would tell me those stories as a kid.
Those stories are important. If they turn, the dark side of that can turn into the humble brag.
Yeah.
In which you are collecting the shot glasses from Prague. You're collecting the Asian motif that you picked up in the Far East or something like that. We want to be careful that we don't want to collect things in a futile attempt to garner admiration from friends or acquaintances for how exciting and adventurous a life we've had.
Yeah.
Hi, Instagram.
Hi, Instagram.
So
#vanlife.
Exactly. So I got one thing. Hang on one second. I'm going over here.
Okay. Chris is actually moving about. He came close to breaking the 6-foot distance, but no, we're still social distance.
I'm going into something. I got a fork. I collect forks of utensils in my utensil drawer. Let's take a fork in this show for part 1.
That was a very dynamic ending to this episode of the Bellingham Podcast. Thank you again so much for listening to us, rating us, reviewing us wherever you like to get our podcast. Remember, if you're in the Bellingham area, you might be listening to us on KMRE 102.3 FM.
They are community powered with forks, knives, spoons, and all over the internets on kmre.org, including that dessert fork that you put, I believe, at the top of the placemats of all your place settings.
And on that note, thank you for tuning into this first part. I'm AJ Barsay.
And I'm your favorite dessert host, Chris Powell. Thanks again for joining us on the Bellingham Podcast. I collect a whole lot of desserts back in the day. Unfortunately, in this current decade, I'm trying to not collect as many pounds as I put on.
Yeah, the COVID poundage.